Okay, so welcome everyone. We have few people already joining us online. So we're about to start the conversation. Just a quick reminder, if you can please mute your microphones as you go in. We will be anyway checking this from this end as well. So we have few people joining us from the phone and around 5 or 6 participants online. Okay. So I think we can kick off, right? Yeah. Okay, so welcome everyone for this event today on, on the subject of trade and gender. This is a subject that is a new area for Amnesty. So we're really happy to really be starting the conversation, and we have Ruth Kelly here to introduce us to that topic. The few words that I'm going to be saying is about the Spark program and how we work with other teams within that space. So the Spark program is a series of initiatives that we organize from the Global Strategy and Impact program with a view to try to bring together different challenges that teams across the movement have, common challenges and similar issues. Or sometimes, like in this case, present relatively new areas of work that we want to explore with everybody. So the Spark program is a series of events in one of the aspects of its functioning, and we work in collaboration with other teams. So today we're working with the Gender and Sexuality program, and basically today we're here to hear about what Ruth needs to say in this area. So in terms of the outline of the session, maybe Venda wants to, you need the mic?
Sure. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome from me as well. So the session will be opened by Yamini, who will say a few introductory remarks, after which Ruth will give her presentation for about 15-20 minutes. And we'll have around 20 or 25 minutes then for questions and discussions afterwards. And in terms of our remote participants, we'd ask everyone to mute their microphones. And we'll also be enforcing that just to avoid any disruptions coming through. And for remote participants to ask questions or participate in the discussion afterwards, I'd ask you to email me. We'll have the email available at the end of the presentation and let you know you want to ask a question. Cool, so I'll give the floor to Ruth and Yamini then.
Thank you for joining us, and thank you to all the colleagues who've joined us remotely. But a very warm welcome to Ruth. Ruth, thank you so much for joining us. As you can see, it's a new area of work for us, but we hope to be making steady step forwards in this direction. So to introduce Ruth, she works with the Center for Applied Human Rights at the University of York, where she's working on a project in partnership with ActionAid. But she also brings in a wealth of experience, having worked with all kinds of organizations, from ActionAid to Oxfam to UNDP to European Commission, so on and so forth. And I think the conversation today is really important, because if you look at the larger body of work around regional or international trade systems, the assumption is that these are gender neutral. And in fact, it's not just trade. Macroeconomics is also assumed to be gender neutral. In fact, there are two assumptions. One big assumption is that trade is gender neutral, and the other big assumption is that free trade, along with policies of deregulation of financial flows, money coming in, liberalization, etc., that the trade will end up being a driver of economic growth. And when economic growth goes on, then therefore there are employment opportunities that will be generated for men and women, and therefore men and women will benefit equally. So a lot of assumptions which we need to challenge. And thankfully, it's just been in the past couple of decades that a body of work has emerged which has started challenging these assumptions. So a lot of studies in the past, I think 2 or 3 decades, basically arguing that that we have to look for the gender differential impact of trade. And it's a very, very challenging area. I encourage all of you to follow, not just follow the presentation, but also to read more about it. Because just when you've thought about women as workers, you'll think, oh my God, I didn't think about women as consumers of products. So you start thinking of women as consumers of products. And then once you've thought of that, you'll think, oh my God, but if the government is reducing the export tariff and the import tariff, government's kitty of resources is also shrinking. And what does that do to government's capacity to mete out redistributive justice programs. So what do you do that? Once you've addressed that, then the bigger question, which is the unpaid care work, the unpaid economy, how do we look at women's work there and the impact of trade on those issues? So it's a very, very interesting and challenging area of work. And Ruth, in her presentation, will do precisely that. She will present to us the various ways, the various analytical framework, the various approaches we can use to analyze the impact of something as complicated as trade on gender. And then she will speak about the impact of trade on women's lives. She'll speak about some of the priorities we need to have in terms of developing our work, what should be our key asks, and what are some of the key actors out there in terms of coalitions, etc. So that's a very exciting conversation we have here for you all today. As Venla mentioned, Ruth wanted to keep her presentation brief so that there's enough time for question and answer. So over to you.
And just in terms of the presentation, if colleagues would like me not to ask a question, but would like me to elaborate on any of the areas that I address more fully, I can also do that because the presentation will be quite brief. So if you could show the first slide, please. So trade policy is not necessarily the area where you might first think to focus, particularly in international human rights law. And one of the reasons I think that it's important for us to think about is because it has a very particular role in the international system. It is the most enforceable body of international law. Unlike in human rights law, decisions of the dispute settlement body in the WTO can be enforced with economic consequences for states that violate it, which makes it very, very unlike any other area of international law, and also means that it trumps other areas of international law, like human rights and environment, even if they, in theory, sit above economic law in the hierarchy of norms. Obviously, there's a lot of economic power and interests behind trade law, so this means that there's pressure put on governments to put a lot of resources into this area, and also the interests of companies who understand the technicalities of this area are quite strong in negotiations. It covers a massive range of issues. So since the 1940s, trade has expanded out from looking just at goods and services, and then expanded to cover movement of people. But increasingly, it's expanded to cover issues like investment, intellectual property protection, commercialization of services, privatization, lots and lots of different things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as trade. Behind the border regulation, for example, standards, food safety standards, other things like that. And that all comes under the WTO. So there's kind of this force, because it's enforceable, it sucks in a lot of other areas. It has an impact on countries' policy space, so it has a very, very real and dramatic impact on what governments can do at national policy in a way that other areas of international law have a softer and more indirect impact. And it's also an area where the experts can very, very quickly pull the wool over your eyes with going down to statistical detail that means a lot and has major implications, but is impossible for anyone who is not a trade expert to understand, even an economist. And there's probably no one who really understands the whole of the trade system. People are experts in different areas of it, but it's something that is kind of an ecosystem that's difficult to get your head around. And next slide. So there are two major approaches to trade and human rights that have been taken in the past. One tends to be using trade as a kind of instrument, a lever, to force governments to implement or to abide by their human rights obligations. So this tends to take the form of rights or gender chapters in trade agreements, and it's used in diplomatic contexts. So diplomatic kind of dialogues are set up around human rights, which you'll all be quite familiar with. The other, which Yamini referenced, is looking more at how macroeconomics, how the economics of trade have an impact on rights, and both the ability of governments to protect and meet their obligations, and also just a direct impact on people's rights, enjoyment of their rights. And this goes back to the question that in the international legal system, trade and investment law tends to trump international human rights law. So it's really important that human rights advocates look in this area. Amnesty International is recently one of the signatories of a new gender and trade coalition statement. It was established by a huge number of different international partners, including women's movements from Asia, Africa, APWLD, Arrow, Femnet, others who are women's movements from around the world, lots of development NGOs, academic partners. And one of the things that's emphasized in a lot of discussion about trade and gender in international policy arenas is that women will be able to participate in trade, and that would be great. And so how can we remove barriers for women participating in trade? How can we get women into factory jobs? How can we get women farmers into supply chains? And this Gender and Trade Coalition, like a lot of the women's movement over the past 3 decades, starting with Dawn and other feminist economists back in the 80s, emphasized that trade actually has a negative impact on women. So the international trade system is largely gender blind and has specifically failed to address adverse, discriminatory and exploitative consequences of the trade system, kind of neoliberal trade system, on women's human rights. So they argue for a feminist and equitable trade policy, which has these positive elements, so that companies are held accountable for abuse. You'll think of the discussions and debates around the binding treaty on business and human rights. That governments can spend money on public goods and services, so think about the impact on trade, both on tax revenue and also on governments' obligations to privatise services that have been commercialised. Then access to essential medicines and sharing of seeds and knowledge is particularly important for women's movements, given their unpaid care burdens, the way that women pick up for the lack of healthcare services in many countries in the world, and also the way that many, many women are farmers who rely on their ability to plant the seeds that they have stored from the previous harvest, which is not possible under intellectual property rules. And then they also think about policy options to generate living wage jobs. So the place of women in global supply chains, and there's a strong overlap with the business and human rights agenda here, is a very big part of feminist trade policy. And also the ability of governments both to invest in industry for job creation purposes, but also to hold food stock holdings and invest in food subsidies and things like that, which are illegal under WTO law. So if you go to the next slide, that begins to show you which key areas of trade law are really important for feminists. So first, there's investor-state dispute settlement, where companies can sue governments if they fail to meet investors' legitimate expectations to profit as they have expected to into the future from their investment. There's also ongoing negotiations around commercialization of services, which under the Trade and Services Agreement, which would mean that if a government privatise a service, as in the UK, the government has privatised the recruitment of agency nurses within the NHS, then under this agreement, unless the government specifically requested the ability to renationalise it, it would no longer be possible to renationalise it. And this has particular implications on water. I'll give a brief example in a minute. Intellectual property rights is one of the biggest international regulatory schemes which protects the rights of firms, including, in theory, to protect the right to kind of innovate, but in practice to protect it's like a rentier capitalism where you protect the big players who are already in the market to the exclusion of new market entrants. And this has impacts on people's ability to access AIDS medicines, seeds. India is a big violator of this. They produce a lot of generic medicines under a WTO exception, but there's contestation about whether that exception might be closed down. And then kind of more fundamentally, there's tariff liberalisation, which is just dropping tariff barriers customs revenue is a primary source of tax revenue for many developing country governments. So this has major implications on the ability of governments to meet their, especially obligations under the Convention on Socio-Economic Rights. The World Bank and others suggest that this customs revenue be replaced with VAT, which is a regressive tax, so it hits the poor harder than it hits the rich. And then finally, under WTO law, there is a lot of prohibitions on certain economic policies. So before we go to there, let me just give you a brief just example of a water dispute in El Salvador. So in El Salvador in about 2003, the government banned mining because the water resources were so heavily polluted. About 97% of the country's water resources were polluted, and there was no drinking water left for people, and they had to figure out what to do. Now, this company called, I think it's, Pacific Rim, was doing an exploration in the country, and when the mining ban came in, they sued the government saying, but we have the right to mine. We don't care about the right for people to have drinking water. We don't care that you want to protect your water resources. So this took about 10 years to go through these private secret investment courts, the World Bank arbitration panel. And eventually, El Salvador won, but it wasn't because the right to water was deemed more important. It was because the company failed on a technicality, and they were not actually eligible for a mining license. But this was 10 years of civil servants' time, of government revenue spent fighting, contesting this case that was just never viable in the first place. But of course, there's a new government now in El Salvador. So just as soon as they won that case, the government is now bringing in a law to privatize water resources. And so students are out in the street, women's movements are out in the street contesting this. But that government wants to privatize it, doesn't want to keep water resources in the state hands. So if that government is negotiating TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, or wants to get involved in TISA, it's not going to say, we want to just keep water separate. They're going to say, no, you can privatize water, and we will bind all future governments that you can never renationalize water in the future, because that's their ideological position. So you have these positions where trade law not only trumps human rights, but also can be used as a tool to prevent future governments from meeting their human rights obligations. There are other examples, obviously, but I thought that was quite a neat one. So if we go on then just for a few minutes and look at the different ways that trade might have an impact on women's lives, looking at women as workers, producers, people who do unpaid work, that could be care or otherwise, and also as consumers, the first one. The major, probably your area where you might know most about trade and women's rights would be in terms of global supply chains. So women dominate the workforce in labor-intensive, low-profit sectors like horticulture, garments, footwear, electronics assembly. They're all industries that are encouraged by the particular way the trade system is set up to be fragmented out into lots of different bits. And the most profitable bits, marketing and distribution, usually sit in Europe or in America. And then the least profitable bits, but the most labor-intensive bits, usually sit in Asia, South America, to a limited degree, Africa, mostly around flowers and horticulture. So a lot of trade experts say trade is great because it creates jobs for women in export sectors. But of course, these jobs are often terrible jobs, and so work by people like the Asia Floor Wage Alliance have argued for a long time that these need to be living wage jobs, that there's a lot of argument around the ways that women, the informalization of labor and the ways that this takes women out of formal legal protection in terms of having contractual rights, having rights to minimum wage, there's a lot of sexual harassment in these sectors, in factories and in plantations. In some ways, a lot of women's work is sex work, just in a kind of a veiled way. And because different countries are competing, like Bangladesh and China and Vietnam and Cambodia are all competing to do exactly the same thing at this very, very low profit end of the market, you have a race to the bottom on wages and conditions. Some people say that this is worse in what are called export processing zones. There's not really much evidence to suggest that. Sometimes the laws, in theory, don't apply in export processing zones and do apply elsewhere. Usually they're just not applied anywhere. Over the past 20 years or so, there's been what's called a flexualization of labor rights. So it's much, much easier to fire people, and workers have fewer rights, and workers' bargaining power has become reduced. In fact, the IMF say this is responsible for about 2/3 of the increase in Gini inequality over the past 20 years, is the loss of labor rights. And of course, increasingly you see people with precarious employment in Europe and America and countries that are rich, as well as countries that where traditionally that has always been the case. Women are also quite dominant in agricultural production, and the change in agricultural production models stimulated by trade liberalization, like the move from subsistence intercropping and reliance on local markets to export-oriented cash crop production, selling like mangoes to London, Burkina Faso farmers selling mangoes to London, which is actually a relatively good export industry, but it's still one that's driven around cash crop production and making money. And this men tend to take over women's land when there's an opportunity to grow crops for cash. And this pushes women onto less productive land, and this is really problematic for food security. So there's lots of dynamics that are in operation in this. This is something that is quite more kind of the economics of trade, but there's serious impacts on food security, and also rights over seeds is a major priority for feminist movements around the world. So if you go on to the next one. Of course, women do a huge proportion of the world's unpaid care and unpaid work within supply chains. So, for example, if a man in a cocoa farm in Ghana has too much work, he'll often get his female family members to come in and support him, but they're not paid. And obviously, women also do productive work on family farms and family businesses, as well as doing reproductive work in the household economy as caring work that keeps the household going. Basically, by doing all this unpaid work for free, a lot of companies then can pay the workers that they have a lot less, because it costs little to live in an economy. So if you live in India and you work in a call center, you can get your lunch really cheap outside the gate because the woman is not paid very much, and then you can often rely on your female family members to do your childcare and your cleaning of your clothes and your cooking and everything, so you can just work. And this means that your life is very cheap. So it's like a subsidy that women are paying to big companies to allow them to make more profits. And there are some real particular issues for women that the trade system has an impact on women's unpaid care responsibilities, particularly with regard to their health care responsibilities, around the cost of medicines, as I alluded to earlier, and also around the privatization of services, because of course the provision of public services is one of the most important interventions that a government can make in order to reduce women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care. And so if we go on to the next one. Finally, and one of the areas where trade advocates say trade is great for women is as consumers. So as import barriers drop, food becomes cheaper, products become cheaper, and you can get access to a wider range of products. This is great. But, as I said earlier, the tariff revenue that is a major source of tax income is replaced by VAT. So it doesn't really make much of a difference for those living in poverty, also who mainly rely on local markets anyway, so it's not that big a difference. The exposure of economies to the international trade system, by opening them up, they become very sensitive to volatility in world markets, particularly fluctuations in the price of oil, which has a major impact on the price of food. And of course, if women aren't actually paid properly, if they don't have good jobs, it's great that food is cheap, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're able to buy it. So Asia Floor Wage Alliance shows how the minimum wage measures against the living wage in countries in Asia. That's like the minimum that is required to live, and it's often about half of the living wage. And they have some diagrams to show exactly how that measures up. So that's great. You can buy cheaper stuff, but you're not paid very much, so you can't really buy cheaper stuff. And so if we go on then to the final slide, just some ideas about advocacy priorities that we could explore, and that some feminist movements and human rights movements are exploring, is around looking at doing impact assessments of potential trade agreements that are being negotiated, or things like TISA, the Trade and Services Agreement, to see what impact will these have on women's lives, and then making sure that those influence the negotiating process. Doing gender-sensitive macroeconomic policy more broadly, as Yamini was alluding to. Kind of resistance and protests. A lot of women are involved in resistance against specific trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that's just been signed, but also investor-state dispute settlement and the Trade and Services Agreement. And then, of course, there's really strong overlaps with the business and human rights agenda, and gender has been really missing from that agenda right from the start as well. There's been some efforts recently to do some more work to integrate gender into that, but it's still, surprisingly, given how much work feminist economists have done on this area, there's very, very little awareness of how to respond to gender-specific concerns in business and human rights. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taster of some of the different things that we might be able to discuss. But then I'm sure that colleagues around the world and colleagues in the room have some questions or contributions they would like to make.
Thank you, Ruth. That was really helpful. So as Ruth presented, you could see the entire canvas of issues that we need to factor in if we're doing an analysis of gender from a trade from a gender lens. So that was really helpful. Thank you. So let's take some questions. I think we'll first invite questions and comments from colleagues who've joined us virtually, and then we can open it up to the room here. How do we want some?
Yeah. If people online have questions, we are muting you guys now. So just chip in with your question. I understand you haven't sent any request to Venla for the floor. So any questions online? No, not for now. Okay. So
let's take questions from the room then. Yes, Ian.
Hi, thanks. My name's Ian. I work in the Economic and Social Rights team here. And as you said, trade is something I think that we aspire to do something on as the biggest human rights organisation, but we've done very little work on trade. But there's different constituencies here in the room, business and human rights, as well as gender colleagues at ESCR. So this is very welcome, and I really appreciate it. So I've got a question which shows my ignorance. This TISA thing, you said you can't renationalise under it. So just to explain that, because I found that, governments to be bound for all time. I guess they could pull out of these agreements, so maybe just explain how you would, go about, obviously, if you wanted to renationalise industry, as opposed to saying, well, once you've done it, that's it, you're bound for all time, which is unusual, and people like Donald Trump might find that unusual in another context. And secondly, I suppose, as you said, it's useful to really useful your last slide about what we can do, because, as you said, so much of this appears existential, and these big macroeconomic, the world is set up I mean, the whole fair trade agenda and how much, I mean, maybe you just comment a little bit on that, you know, because again, people think, well, fair trade is the opposite of the trade markets, but, you know, are there problems with the fair trade agenda as well that maybe don't encapsulate a proper gender-focused approach? Thank you.
Very good. Do you want to gather some?
Yeah, let's take some more questions. Maybe I can add mine to Ian's, and then, so just a couple of questions. One, this whole WTA debate and the issue around sovereign space, and we see a lot of countries, developing countries now coming in to say that we need to protect our agriculture because starvation levels, poverty levels in our countries are very high. And then you have the context of Europe where the agricultural market is hugely protected. So how do we handle some of these, if I may use the word, double standards around some of these multilateral treaties like WTO, or how, I mean, what is the way out for protecting important sectors like agriculture? The second issue is the argument that we've always heard that reduction in export and import taxes will reduction in a smaller kitty available to the government for all kinds of redistributive work. Is there evidence on that, or is that just a theoretical argument? Because the rate, yes, you're slashing down the rates, but if the exports are growing up, do the volumes make up for the reduction in tariff, or have we seen examples of countries where actually the tax kitty has gone down? And then again, there's another assumption there that if the tax were higher, the government would have actually used it for developmental purposes and not for all kinds of wasteful expenditure. So is there any evidence there? And the third quick issue is on the issue of special economic zones and EPZs, as you mentioned. And in India, we saw that when special economic zones came in, not only were the companies in the special economic zones given a lot of tax holidays, but also there were explicit conditions placed, such as the fact that labor in these economic zones could not unionize, they couldn't form trade unions, etc. Labor laws were diluted, labor standards were diluted. So how do we factor in that? Thank you.
That's great. Okay, so maybe I'll go with those. To start with the TISA question. There is a way that governments are already bound or they suffer consequences for renationalization of services. The Transnational Institute have done a really good report looking at remunicipalization of services in lots of different cities around the world. But often investors who were running those services would sue the government for their expected profits. So they can renationalize at the moment, but they suffer potential economic consequences. Under TISA, it's very unclear what's going to happen because it's under negotiation and the negotiation texts are secret. Under the current scheme, you can always renationalize a privatized service unless you have put it on a list to say, we're happy just to let this be privatized always in the future. The TISA will flip that on its head. So it will say, you have to put it on a list if you want to retain the option to renationalize. Now, what that will look like in terms of actual binding future governments is not completely clear because the negotiating texts aren't public and negotiations have stalled. But it's likely to have economic consequences, but not be completely binding. Governments can usually break trade rules. In fact, Hajun Chang, an economist, says that developing country governments should break trade rules more often because the consequences aren't actually quite as big as they seem to be. The problem is twofold. First, that governments who don't have a lot of litigating power might be really worried about doing that. So it makes it difficult for less well-resourced governments to break rules. And also, it goes hand in hand with a real push, say, from the World Bank and others towards privatization. So there's a double kind of incentive to privatize. Of course, all international law binds future governments. So in some ways, it's not different in theory from human rights law. You know, human rights law binds one government negotiates it, and all governments are bound to it. Now, of course, it's very, very different in principle, but it's just an example of how international economic law operates it looks a bit like international human rights law, but it's just easier to enforce. In terms of the fair trade question, the fair trade movement is a complicated movement, and recently there have been a lot of battles and disagreements within that movement, which I won't summarize because I would do a very bad job and I'd probably offend somebody. But generally, fair trade works for small-scale producers of agricultural goods like chocolate. It's not very good for plantation crops, so it's never worked particularly well for tea or coffee because it's about sharing parts of the profits with the original producer. It doesn't really work for workers on big plantations, and it doesn't really deal with factories. So fair trade is good for a very small group of companies, and there are other fair trade-like initiatives which are looking at kind of social enterprise, different models of enterprise and business and different ways of structuring our economy, which are really exciting and interesting areas of innovation. But fair trade as such doesn't really help most women who are in positions of employment rather than as producers benefiting from fair trade dividends. In terms of the double standards of agricultural protection, so yes, one of the things that the WTO law system has done is they haven't prevented protection of sensitive sectors, but they've made it more expensive and bureaucratic to protect sensitive sectors. So the CAP payments, the Common Agricultural Policy subsidies in the UK, are called green box subsidies under the WTO law. That means they're okay because they don't distort the market, honestly, like paying farmers in the UK £30,000 a year doesn't distort the market at all. So there's, it's kind of tongue in cheek. It's technically non-market distorting, but then it's quite complicated to set up a scheme like that is a green box scheme, and so governments who have less bureaucracy and less money would struggle to do that. So then struggle to pay subsidies that are acceptable under WTO law. There's lots of other ways that rich countries protect their markets through standards, import standards, lots and lots of different ways. And there's a great book by a writer called Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State, which talks about how basically every component of the iPhone, apart from its commercialization, was funded by the US government. And so all governments around the world protect and invest in industry in order to create jobs. But some countries can get away with it, and some countries are brought to court for doing so. I'm not really sure how we get around that, apart from just always kind of talking. Hadjin Chang says break the rules, but we should always talk about how actually the US, Europe, others are doing it. So it's not just kicking away the ladder. They used to do it, so why shouldn't developing countries be able to do it? They are still doing it. So there is a real double standards there. In terms of the tax question, it's difficult to know exactly. I used to work on this, and I have some graphs that are floating in my head, and I can't remember exactly what they say. I know that ActionAid did some work on that precise question. Does reduction in customs revenue actually reduce tax take? The thing is that it's so often replaced by VAT, which is an exceptionally efficient way of tax collection, so you get a lot of tax in. So usually it might not reduce tax take, but it puts more of the tax burden on the poor than it was before when it was customs revenue. And then it also doesn't, again, through ActionAid's work, because I used to work on tax with ActionAid, the idea would be to invest in corporate income tax collection, especially from the super rich, property tax. A lot of people talk about property taxes. So it's not necessarily that the economics say that the tax take reduces, but it changes and has a differential impact and has bigger impact on women. Then in terms of EPZs, especially around that you can't form unions in economic processing zones. So this is true. This is something that's quite complicated under international human rights law. So the whole question of unionization, firstly, there's a challenge between do we believe that non-independent unions are better than no unions. So, for example, a lot of human rights advocates would say that the Vietnamese state-sponsored unions are inherently bad, and yet feminist economists show that as their power has reduced, working standards have also reduced. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're perfect, and it doesn't mean that workers' rights are perfect in Vietnam by any means, but there are ways that human rights advocates have approached the question of unionization, which can be very can be a little bit ideological sometimes, I think, and doesn't always look at what's on the ground. And then, of course, independent unions don't necessarily support women's rights. So the representation of women in unions is very weak. And organizations like WIGO, who's a movement of women in informal employment around the world, many of you will know them, have worked for decades on how to actually organize with women actually representing themselves, and how we can organize in the informal sector, including domestic workers. They can organize, it's not impossible, but then you get a question of recognition of unions by employers beyond their kind of legal status, and then also whether unions actually have an impact, whether they have any bargaining power or any impact on wage levels and conditions. So that's so those questions are a bit complicated. So I think that the kind of lack of unionization in EPZs isn't so dramatically different from the situation in other places, even though legally it looks different, because the women's representation in unions is so poor anyway. And ITUC does a lot of work on that. And their most recent, again, another human rights issue that this brings in, their most recent global workers' rights unions, or index, sorry, emphasizes the challenges around human rights defenders in the labour sector. So labour rights activists who are killed, who are blacklisted, who, you know, all these informal practices of preventing their human rights advocacy, which I know is a concern for Amnesty as well. So hopefully that was...
So I have a question around what's your opinion as an external critical friend, and please, you know, try and play that role. What do you see could be Amnesty's added value to the conversation? For example, like specifically in the space of the Gender and Trade Coalition, but more broadly in the topic.
Yeah.
Given, well, of course, you know the kind of work that we do. We are opening this event by saying that this is a new area for us. So what is your opinion in that, broadly speaking, if you have some thoughts? And also, maybe it's a question also for Yamini. So it would be interesting for us to hear that from your perspective.
I have a question as well that I think is related, and a more general one. So these are obviously extremely complex issues that have to do with economic justice and that are related to kind of very deeply in flawed structures and systems, and human rights are often criticized as not being the best suited for challenging kind of root causes and deep structures. So I want to hear your vision about if the human rights approach is the most effective approach, in your opinion, for challenging these, and similarly, what can it particularly maybe bring that other approaches can't?
Yeah.
So maybe expanding from your question of what could be Amnesty's role to look at the human rights movement and approach more generally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great.
And any questions online? Sorry, you're all unmuted if anybody wants to jump in.
Yes,
Go ahead, we can hear you.
Hello. Yeah, excuse me, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep. Can I just ask who's speaking so I can mute other people?
Yes, I'm Fatimata Ouedraogo, and yes, I'm Youth and Gender Coordinator from Amnesty Burkina. And my question is related in women in agriculture.
Yeah.
I want to know in a context like Burkina Faso, where women are rarely legal owners of the lands they are working on, how can we integrate the property rights Act into trade policies?
Yeah. Great, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question following the example that you were giving of the country, I think it was Costa Rica?
El Salvador.
El Salvador, sorry. El Salvador, which had decided to ban mining to preserve like the right to water to its population, and how it had been challenged by a corporation, but eventually was dismissed on a technicality. So I was wondering if there had been other examples and other precedents where such like conflicting situation that happened between like a corporation's right to trade versus human rights, and if there had been one or the other that had gained sort of primacy over this, and also what it means then more broadly in terms of like the human rights framework versus like the international economic trade law.
So
So just building on from where Leslie and Venla left. So as a human rights organization, I think we do the job of calling out human rights violations in the lives of people very well. So here's a community whose right to water has been denied. So this is a human rights violation, and that's a kind of work I think Amnesty has been good at over the years. But the other part, which is what you also mentioned, which is the fact that many of these trade laws actually trump over human rights law. I'm wondering, as an international human rights organization, if there's more scope to do work there, because the human rights law also have a legal basis, right? So I don't know who prioritized this, and is there any scope for that to be challenged, and can we sort of add our voice to that level of advocacy? And this next question that I wanted to ask is, in the gender and macroeconomics discourse, one of the arguments that is always used is that investing in gender equality is good economic sense, right? So the whole economic efficiency argument that it makes sense for governments to have gender equality because it's good economics. But in this case, more than in any other case, the reverse is also so true, no? Like you mentioned about the race to the bottom. So the lesser you pay the women in the garment industry in Bangladesh, the more competitive your exports are, and so on and so forth. So the race to the bottom, as you rightly said. So I'm wondering, apart from non-tariff barriers, which are oftentimes imposed to address some of these issues, isn't there any openness at the level of WTO to address some of these concerns? Because then the first assumption, which is that trade is a driver of growth, in itself falls totally flat. And if that falls flat, then how do the neoliberal economic pundits sort of sustain their argument, I'm wondering?
Okay. So I'll take the questions that are more specific first, and then I'll open out into the potential role of Amnesty. And merci Fatimata d'avoir suivi le débat en anglais. Je sais que c'est un peu difficile de suivre un débat si technique. Alors merci de votre question. So with women in agriculture, particularly, say, in Burkina Faso women or women across many countries who don't have legal ownership of land, this is a central aspect of trades, of the women's economic empowerment movement in international trade policy. So they say, if only women had legal rights to land, then they could participate in international supply chains, and they would be able to benefit from the international trade structures. So in some ways, there are unintended good consequences of the trades, of neoliberal interest in getting women involved in trade. Because if you give women land rights, that's good anyway. So this has parallels in lots of different ways that land rights have been given to women. So, for example, previously it was said, well, if women only have land rights, they'll take out mortgages and be entrepreneurs. And of course, no women actually do, because that would be crazy. But it gives them land rights, so that's good. And it has good consequences, and it often gives them access. If you have land, then you can access certain state benefits, and that has good knock-on consequences. But just having land rights doesn't necessarily help you integrate into the trade system. It might, in terms, especially for Burkinabe women, are some of the women for whom the fair trade system works, because they are often producers of dried mangoes, and a lot of fair trade dried mangoes come from Burkina, and so that works quite well. But there are two ways in which this is problematic. First, often when there are opportunities for selling crops for cash, even if women have legal ownership over their land, their male people, in other men or higher status women in the village might take over their land anyway, and they don't. Legal rights over land doesn't necessarily mean that you have practical rights over land. And then secondly, even when people have rights over land, there are ways that companies and governments and other kind of big organizations can buy up that land legally in problematic ways. So in India, for example, quite famously, there's a right for compulsory purchase for public purposes. This is usually used for things like building roads or building railways. But in India, they've expanded the definition so much that any investor who wants to buy land to set up a massive farm, that's called public purposes. So there's ways, the law is always the law is the friend of the rich, and there's always ways that you can make legal mechanisms for trampling on people's rights. It's not just by breaking the law that you can do that. So the property rights thing is a little bit complicated, but one of the unintended good consequences of the gender in trade movement. So in terms of the ISDS, do states sometimes win? Yes, actually states win quite a lot. When investors sue states, a lot of investors sue states for very spurious reasons that they're never going to win. But there are two problems with this. First, that the cost of a case is kind of between 8 and 10 million pounds, and states don't always get awarded the costs. So even if they win, they may still have to pay a huge amount of money for the lawyers and the arbitration to defend the case. And secondly, it puts a kind of a block. A lot of people call this a freeze on policy making. So it just prevents governments doing risky things because they're worried they're going to be sued. So there are cases, and increasingly there's been a lot of debate in the community, investor-state dispute settlement community, about whether rights should be able to trump kind of economic considerations, especially very basic rights like right to water. And this has been particularly strong in the right to water cases where companies have hiked water rates, and then the government have renationalized the company, and then the company says, but we have the right to charge whatever we want for water. And those cases are I think there have been cases where they have not been won just on technicality, but that the human rights considerations have had some influence in the decision making. The problem is that this whole system is not like a normal court system. You can't read the judgments or the reasoning of the arbitral body. They're all secret. It's not based on precedent. It's not like if one case is decided one way, then it's more likely the next case will be decided that way as well. It's all just random people. The people who decide the cases are the same people who act for the companies. So the arbitrators are the judges. And some people want to say, okay, we can fix this system by setting up an international investment court. And we can say that they have to take into account human rights considerations. And this, in some ways, has been done in trade law. So trade and investment law kind of work alongside. So in the WTO dispute settlement body, in theory, they can take into account some environmental and human rights considerations in their decision making. But for the lawyers in the room, there's kind of necessity tests. So basically, there was a really interesting dispute, which some people might know of, called the Mercosur pulp mills case, where a group of protesters were blocking a road in protest in Argentina, in protest against pulp mills, paper mills, for its pollution and other impacts. And a lot of the Inter-American Court ruled in the favor of the community, others ruled, the Supreme Court, but the Mercosur Court, that's the body for the regional trade agreement, said, but it wasn't actually necessary that they block the road. Yes, it's more important to have a right to protest than it is to be able to trade. But, by blocking the road, they were blocking people's right to move between countries. They could have protested, beside the road, and kind of misses the whole point of, the only reason their protest was successful was because they were blocking the road. So just because you have a multilateral investment court doesn't mean that the logic is going to be a logic that that human rights lawyers would recognize as valid. So in terms of where kind of human rights is most effective in how it could be most effective. As it's kind of come out maybe in what I've said, a lot of human rights cases are decided on technicalities. I'm sure you all know this from your national human rights law understandings as well. It's actually in the international human rights regime is almost the only place where cases are decided on principle. Others, it's often technicalities. So sometimes the most effective way to bring human rights concerns to bear on the international economic system is to be very, very good technical economic law experts. As with, say, in the UK, to be a good human rights lawyer, you want to know the judicial review system inside out and back to front. And your knowledge of international human rights law is actually quite marginal. But that said, there's stuff that human rights law can bring. It can bring a highlight to particular aspects of economic law that are ignored by economic law experts, and it can. So the principle and the advocacy and the storytelling and all the things that Amnesty is good at, that holds even if cases are won on technicalities. And of course, as you know as well, law cases are always part of a bigger movement. And I guess this is where, and I listened to some of the debate that you had last week around austerity, and this is where actually Amnesty can play quite an important role. Amnesty is a very well-regarded organisation. In fact, it's perhaps positioned for some people, or at least attractive to some people who are maybe a little bit more right of centre than other, like Andrew Mitchell used to call ActionAid the most Marxist of NGOs, and we wore that badge with pride. But it plays it has a different role in the policy space. Amnesty can do things that other agencies can't. It's also and then to think about Amnesty as part of an ecosystem. I think then as in coalition with people around the world, working with women's movements who've been working on these things for very long, I think is great. And I think a lot of and I wouldn't want to speak for women's movements around the world, but I think that they would be keen that Amnesty wouldn't steal the spotlight. But there is a role that Amnesty can do in kind of introducing their arguments and their perspectives into policy spaces and kind of giving increased legitimacy to the perspectives of women's movements themselves. And I think a good first step is on signing onto the Gender and Trade Coalition statement. So hopefully that's helpful.
That was excellent. So we've run out of time, Gabby. We'll need to wind up, yeah? So thank you so much, Ruth. That was most illuminating. And I really hope, as Jan was also saying, that we can develop our own work on these issues beyond just signing on to that letter, which was, in a way, our first step. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the colleagues who've joined us remotely. And a big thanks to Gabby and her team for putting this whole event together. Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much. And just a reminder as well to people online that we will be distributing the recording of this session, as well as hopefully the presentation that Ruth gave us today. And yeah, so please stay tuned for other Spark events.
Thank you.
That was okay. Really good. Just a very great. Slightly more yeah, exactly.
For us, it's a first
No, yeah, exactly. And it's a balance, isn't it? That hopefully it was right. But yeah,